You probably haven't heard the name Lee Mosley, but this guy's story, it's scary. It shows some really messed up things about how our justice system works. Mosley was this serial killer and rapist, just terrorized Fort Lauderdale, Florida, left behind tons of victims, and just a messed up system. But it's not just about him. It's about how two streetly innocent guys, Frank Lee Smith and Jerry Townsend, ended up taking the fall for what he did.
Yeah,
How could something like that even happen? How did they screw up so badly?
that's what we're going to try and figure out in this deep dive.
All right, so let's just dive right into it. Mosley's life and what happened because of his actions.
All right, well, Mosley's story, it really shows you how social problems and problem with the courts get all tangled up. He was born poor back in 1947, and right away he showed signs that he wasn't developing normally. Like, some people would even say he was mentally unstable.
Oh, wow.
He had a rough time in school, dropped out when he was only 13, and very quickly he started having run-ins with the law. It started small, like stealing stuff, but then escalated to assault and even attempted rape.
So, right from when he was young, there were already warning signs. Did anyone try to step in and help, or did he just slip through the cracks?
That's the big question. Okay, so between 1971 and 1973, there were almost 150 rapes reported just in Fort Lauderdale. And they all had this creepy thing in common. Mosley would target women when they were alone, choke them, and then attack. In 73, 3 women who were incredibly brave identified him, and then get this, over 40 others said it was him from pictures.
Oh, my God.
He was also the main suspect in the rape and murder of 2 young girls, but back then, they just didn't have enough evidence to officially charge him.
That must have been terrifying. For the whole community, 150 rapes in just 2 years? That's insane.
Absolutely, and this is where things take a big turn. They decided Mosley was insane and locked him up in a mental institution for 5 years. And you know what? When he was locked up, all those similar rapes and murders in Fort Lauderdale, they stopped.
Okay, so maybe it wasn't the best solution, but at least he was with the streets. But they let him out eventually, right? What happened then?
They did. In 1979, they decided he was cured and let him go. But almost as soon as he got back to Fort Lauderdale, the nightmare started all over again. Within 7 months, they found 7 young girls raped and murdered. Then Mosley took off to Lakeland, Florida. And guess what? He became the prime suspect in 2 more young girls going missing, Ida Eagles and Letha Mae Williams.
It's unbelievable. They just let him walk free after all that had happened. What was going on with those insanity evaluations? Were they just not good enough?
That's what we need to figure out. Was there pressure from politicians to let him out? Did they just not understand how dangerous he was? Was there a real belief that he was cured? Or were there other things influencing that decision?
That's just mind-boggling. What about those poor girls in Lakeland? Did they ever solve those cases?
It's really sad. They found their skeletons much later. But by then, Mosley was already back in Fort Lauderdale, locked up for 15 years for attempted rape.
15 years. You'd think that would be enough to keep him behind bars.
You would think, right? But not this time. They overturned his conviction because his lawyer messed up. He got a shorter sentence and a new trial, and because he'd already served a good chunk of time, he got parole in 1983.
So back to square one. Every time they tried to hold him accountable, it seems like it just blew up in their faces.
It's incredibly frustrating. And it's about to get even worse because this is where Frank Lee Smith's wrongful conviction comes into the picture. Okay, so in 1985, there's this terrible thing that happens. 8-year-old Chandra Whitehead, she's raped and murdered right in her own home.
Oh my God.
It just shook the community. And there was so much pressure to find whoever did it.
Right.
Frank Lee Smith, he'd already spent time in prison for a different murder, and he became their main target.
This is where it just gets heartbreaking. Frank Lee Smith, a totally innocent man, he's convicted. They sentence him to death for a crime Lee Mosley committed.
It really shows you how messed up things can get. Eyewitness misidentification, problems with the evidence, bad lawyers, all of it led to this horrible miscarriage of justice. Smith always said he was innocent, but they still sent him to death row.
I can't imagine how hopeless he must have felt, knowing you didn't do it, but having no way to prove it and facing execution. It's
Awful. And to make things even worse, Smith died on death row in 2000, just a few months before DNA evidence finally proved he was innocent.
It's a really powerful reminder of how badly things can go wrong and how high the stakes are.
Yeah. And tragically, it wasn't just Smith. Jerry Townsend got caught up in this whole mess, too.
Right.
He had an intellectual disability, and they actually forced him to confess to several murders. One of them was 15-year-old Naomi Gamble.
It's crazy how often that happens in these wrongful conviction cases, forcing confessions. What happened with Townsend? What made him confess to things he didn't do?
Well, with his disability, he was really vulnerable to their tactics. You know, the way they questioned him, they pressured him, intimidated him, and he eventually broke down, confessed to all these crimes he had nothing to do with. He spent 22 years in prison. 22 years. Before Mosley's DNA finally proved his innocence in 2001.
Two innocent men, their lives basically stolen because the system that was supposed to protect them completely failed. It's just devastating.
Their stories really make it clear how much we need to change the way our criminal justice system works. We have to fix the things that lead to these wrongful convictions. We have to make sure that when they question people, it's done ethically, and that people who are vulnerable get the protection they need.
Absolutely. So Mosley's out there avoiding justice, continuing his horrible crimes, and these two innocent guys are suffering the consequences. But he did finally face justice in the end, right?
Yeah, they finally caught him in 1987. For stealing, actually. But there was this twist of fate, a routine blood test. It showed that his blood type matched samples they had from a bunch of murder scenes.
Wow.
Finally, they had real proof connecting him to the murders of Teresa Dials and Emma Cook. He actually confessed too, but then took it back later, saying they forced him to.
You mentioned before that a rape case against him in 1984 got thrown out even though there was strong evidence. It sounds a lot like what happened with Townsend's confession. Do we know anything about that 1984 case? Did they ever look into how he managed to get off?
That particular case is still a bit of a mystery, unfortunately. We know he was acquitted, but why the jury decided that way, it's not really clear. Did the prosecutors mess up presenting their case? Did the defense lawyers do something really clever to convince the jury? Those are questions that we still need to find answers to.
It's unsettling to think that a guy who would later admit to all these murders could get away with a violent crime like that. It makes you wonder if there was a bigger problem with how the justice system was handling all of Mosley's cases.
Exactly. This wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern of missed opportunities and bad decisions. And in the end, those failures had really tragic consequences that couldn't be undone.
We've really uncovered some messed up stuff with this Mosley case, but what can we even do about it? What have we learned from this whole thing so that nothing like it ever happens again?
Well, it's a powerful reminder that when the system messes up, real people get hurt. We have to look at these failures not just as single events, but as signs of bigger problems within our justice system.
So where do we even start? These problems seem so big.
Well, one important area is early intervention. Like with Mosley, you can see how the violence just kept getting worse. Could someone have stepped in, maybe when he was a kid or when he first got in trouble with the law?
So are you saying we need to focus less on reacting to crime after it happens and more on dealing with the things that cause it in the first place?
Exactly. We got to invest in social programs, education, mental health resources, especially in communities that don't have much. If we can deal with those root causes, maybe we can stop people from turning to crime in the first place.
But what about when it's clear that someone has mental health problems, like Mosley? How do we keep people safe while making sure that these individuals get the treatment and help they need?
That's a tough one. There's no easy answer. But Mosley's case shows that just saying someone's cured and letting them go, well, it doesn't always work. We need a better way to evaluate mental health within the legal system.
I can see how some people might think that if someone's mentally ill, they shouldn't be held responsible for what they do. How do we balance that with making sure victims and their families get justice?
It's a balancing act, no doubt. We need a system that looks at each person's situation while also keeping everyone safe. We can't ignore mental illness, but we can't just let people off the hook for their actions either. We got to have a system that provides treatment and helps people get better, but also holds them accountable.
Okay, so a more well-rounded approach, but we can't forget about those innocent people who got caught in the middle of all this. Frankly Smith and Jerry Townsend, they're like the worst examples of how badly things can go wrong. How do we stop these wrongful convictions from happening?
Their cases really highlight the need to fix things that lead to innocent people being convicted. We got to rethink how we get eyewitness statements, make sure they're actually reliable and not influenced by, suggestive techniques.
Eyewitness misidentification, yeah, that's a big factor in a lot of these cases. What else needs to change?
Forced confessions. That's a huge problem, too. Think about Townsend's case. He was pressured into admitting to things he never did. We got to have stricter rules for how police do interrogations. Make sure it's all ethical, record everything so we have proof of what happened.
And we can't forget about evidence that might not be reliable, like the forensic stuff.
Totally. We got to invest in better training for forensic scientists and make sure those labs are doing everything by the book, following the highest standards. DNA was key in proving Smith and Townsend were innocent, but a lot of times it's not available or it gets mishandled. That can't happen.
This all sounds like a huge undertaking. Where do we even begin?
It starts with people knowing about these issues. Cases like Mosley's, we have to talk about them, learn from them. We got to support groups like the Innocence Project. They're fighting for those wrongly convicted and pushing for real change. We got to hold our elected officials accountable, push for laws that put justice and fairness first.
It's like a call to action for everyone. Mosley's story is a tragedy, no doubt, but it can also push us to make things better. We owe it to the victims, their families, and the people who were wrongly convicted to create a system that actually protects people and delivers real justice.
It's about everyone having an equal chance at a fair system, no matter who they are, where they come from. It's about realizing that when the system screws up, the consequences can be huge. And in the end, it's our responsibility to fight for a system that reflects our values: justice, fairness, accountability.
This has been a tough deep dive, but it's a conversation we can't stop having. We got to learn from the past so we can build a better future. Thanks for listening, everyone. Let's keep working for a world that's more just for everyone. JGO Lee, Helitrax COC.